our final commentator is Professor Matthew Ricketson. He's Professor of Journalism at Deakin after a long and distinguished career, including writing for many, many years for The Age newspapers in Fairfax. He's also a member of the Press Council and was one of the principal architects of what's known as the Finks inquiry, or Finkelstein, Ray Finkelstein QC, who was commissioned by the former Labor government to advise on reforming press laws in what is still an extraordinary episode in recent Australian political history.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to this event. I'm very pleased to be here, very honoured, and as John has already mentioned, Richard Ackland is the kind of doyen in the media field of journalists who deal with stuff to do with the media and the law, and so I'm going to leave that particular aspect of the issue to him. In the brief opening remarks I wanted to make, I wanted to start by posing a question, which is the combined Australian mainstream media has for about 6 or 7 months now been campaigning vigorously through its own organs to persuade the government, the federal government, to change the laws to do with the media. The question is, how successful do you think they have been so far? I just ask you to hold that thought, because I'm not going to answer just yet. I'll let you think about that, because now I want to take you back in time about 9 years or so to another event that John alluded to, which was the inquiry into the media and media regulation that the former Labor government set up under Julia Gillard. Ray Finkelstein, retired federal court judge, a QC was as is the way of these things, asked to head up the inquiry, and I was the sort of media person to provide him with advice. And I don't know if any of you know Ray Finkelstein, but the first thing he said to me was, "I know nothing at all about the media," and then said, "You're the guy, you're the expert, you tell me everything." And I'm not quite sure of my strike rate in terms of the advice that I gave him that he accepted, but I think it was relatively low. So he very much has his own mind. He worked extremely hard to get across all of the nuances of the media industry and its issues and regulation, and read back in the history of press freedom, all of the kind of sources way, way back into ancient Greece and ancient Rome and so on. So I'm not going to go through that whole contest again, because we'd be here for another 10 minutes. But suffice to say, the report or the inquiry looked into the way in which the Press Council was operating and the way in which media regulation and accountability in this country was working. In short, concluded it wasn't working very well at all and made some recommendations to improve that. Okay? The news media as an industry overwhelmingly rejected the recommendations of the report, which is their right. The problem was that they never really reported in any great detail what was actually in the report. So unless you've read the report, and it's 468 pages long, and there's only 2 jokes in it, and I know because I put them both in, you won't know what's in that thing. So this kind of weird debate occurred whereby no one really knew what we were debating about, and Ray Finkelstein and I were compared to Joseph Stalin and others of his ilk in terms of what we were going to do to freedom of the press in this country. And in 2013 there was a kind of half-hearted and cack-handed attempt to actually make some law out of our report and another one that was being done at the same time, the Convergence Review, and it all fell over spectacularly. During this time, the media had campaigned vociferously and vigorously against these proposals, and they died a sorry death, and not many people were all that sad about it, and not many people wanted to revisit the issue. And so there's 2 things that come out of that. One is that the issue of how properly to hold the news media to account, as most people think it should be, if it holds others to account, the government, as Annika has talked about, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, hospitals, all of these other institutions in society. If the news media holds them to account, and it does and it should, why would not the news media itself be held to account? And if our mechanisms for doing that are flawed, that's a significant problem, precisely because the news media is so valuable and freedom of the press is so important in our society. So work done either terribly, if you believe one set of views, or left unfinished is another way to perceive it on that issue. And as John alluded to, you're doing all my stuff for me, John, Mark Zuckerberg and regulation, finally 10 years later, people are saying actually maybe some regulation is needed of online media because, as Emily Bell, formerly of The Guardian, has said and written very eloquently, Facebook has eaten the world, both in a user sense, almost everybody's on Facebook, and in a money sense, as in they have cannibalised the media business model which supported media for so many years and supported it quite handsomely and well, but no longer. So, one media campaign by the media about itself was very, very successful back in 2011, 12, 13. The question I ask is, how successful do you think this campaign has been so far? I mean, I guess you're probably getting a sense that I think the answer to that question is not very successful at all so far. There is some discussion going on at federal government level about the need to reform the laws of defamation, which Richard may pick up, and which absolutely is needed. But what has struck me is the contrast between one very successful campaign run by the media about 10 years ago, and so far one that is kind of bouncing off the Prime Minister, a bit like, you know, all of our thoughts and concerns and so on about the bushfires recently. So I don't know what's going on there. I'm happy to talk about a few ideas I have about why that is, but I think at this stage I'll leave those opening remarks there and we can pick them up if you wish in further discussion and questions. Thank you.
Matthew, can you take us through, do you think the Right to Know campaign, if you could explain what it is and then tell us whether you think it's going to achieve anything?
Okay, well, the Right to Know campaign has actually been around for about, well, more than a decade, since around 2007, 2008. But it's a coalition of all of the mainstream media companies, News Corp, the ABC, Fairfax Media before it became part of Nine as well, who else? Macquarie Media and so on. So most of the major media players are in it, and they are quite rightly concerned about a number of things. One of them, or a couple of them, have already been alluded to, such as the problems with the laws of defamation, which, I mean, Richard's much more eloquent and knowledgeable on this than I am, but many cases are being lost, that is, by media companies on what look like fairly spurious technical legal grounds. The number of suppression orders that are made by judges around the country, in particular in Victoria here, something like 1,590 or something at the moment, in a report I read just recently.
Suppression orders?
Suppression orders.
How many of those are about Nicola Gobbo, I wonder?
Well, yes. There used to be when I worked at The Age, there was a journalist whose job was to track all of the suppression orders and how they related, and she was an absolute font of knowledge on that, but needed to be. Suppression orders, defamation, national security laws, and the fact that we've had both a lot of them enacted in the past 20 years since the September 11 attacks, and that they are increasingly onerous for the doing of journalism. They make it they almost, well, some would say they criminalise the act of doing journalism, and that's one of the things that obviously Annika's run into. There's a couple of other, there were 6 main arms to the Right to Know's campaign. Freedom of information, which it's an old joke, but it has become freedom from information. It's an act that's been around now since 1982 or 3 federally, and 1982 in Victoria, and
John Cain.
John Cain, the late John Cain, brought it in, and there are so many exemptions in those acts that governments can and do drive trucks through them in order to not release documents that the objects of the act say, all of us in this room, not only journalists, but every single person in this room and around the state and the country has the right to apply for access to documents. That's what a Freedom of Information Act is supposed to be. So I've probably left out one or two, but the point is that there were a range of issues that the media is, in my view, quite rightly concerned about, and so they gathered themselves together as a coalition to lobby government quite explicitly and deliberately, and in my view, so far not particularly successfully, and I'm just not quite sure why that is, when they generally, there's an old adage which I think is attributed to Mark Twain, which is never pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. And as you can see from the 19th century reference, it's about newspapers and the fact that if you own newspapers, you have a great deal of ability to not only get your message across in any kind of public lobbying, but to get it across megaphone style. You can do that. That historically, when the media campaigns, even in isolation, that is even one company or one newspaper, they can have a huge impact on government. All of the media is campaigning on this, and maybe some movement on defamation law. I'd be really interested in what Richard's views on that are, but not so far on other things. And I think that my thinking about that is one of the reasons is that the media environment has changed. The mainstream news media is nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. There's so many other voices out there, whether it's ordinary citizens, whether it's conspiracy theorists, etc. And there are now mechanisms, as you would have maybe be aware of, for amplifying what used to be the kind of things that your crazy Uncle Arthur said after too many Reds at Christmas, and most people in the family would just ignore him. Now they're everywhere all over the internet, and they get spread and they get shared and they get amplified, and they tend to drown out a lot of the coverage that's going on from Annika's newspapers and other media outlets, the ABC and so on.
You've been on the receiving end of a pile-on by the Murdoch media, sorry Annika, but when the Finks report that you were so involved in, the Fink is his name when he was at the bar, and it was a very funny gag at the time because, as you've noticed, Matthew's very tall. For those of you not aware, Ray Finkelstein is exceptionally short, and it was always said this report will be the long and the tall, the long and the short, or whatever gag people came up with of the topic. But when Fink's report came down, it was extraordinary, the pile-on, and some of it directed personally at you. Do you think the media is united in its concern over these issues, or are we going to see the same fragmentation and the same tit-for-tat, the same tribalism that resulted from the report you co-authored?
My sense is that they are united. They are. I haven't seen anyone stepping out and saying all of those issues we've been talking about are not good issues to be campaigning on. So I haven't seen that. They were united back then, and there was a pile-on. Some of it was personal. I was someone who had worked as a journalist since the early 1980s and have always believed in both the value of journalism and the freedom of the press. And so I was a bit gobsmacked, I have to say, by the way in which I was quite up for a debate about the report. There are things you could absolutely contest in there and have a good debate about, but that debate didn't happen. And it's a trend that Laura Tingle outlined, the ABC's Laura Tingle outlined at a conference I was at late last year, where she was talking about the Gonski reforms, and everyone just shorthands Gonski, but it was a plan by the previous Labor government to change the way in which the allocation of money for schools was going to happen and to make it fairer for all. That was the kind of idea. Whether they got there or not is another matter, but Laura's point was that when the final Gonski report was about to be delivered, either immediately before it was delivered or immediately after, Christopher Pyne, who was then the Shadow Minister for Education, piped up and said, this is a terrible report, we reject it entirely, and the media coverage went stampeding off in that direction and never actually stopped and said, well, what is actually in the Gonski report? What is his argument? What's his evidence? What's his idea? You had to read a lot and quite widely to even find that. And the most recent example of this to me is the bill about religious discrimination, which it's very hard to find an actual account saying what is being proposed, how that might be moving, and then some just discussion about what do you think about this? Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea?
Trying to define the public interest, you're telling us, is somewhat elastic and an exercise in futility. So those people who are entrusted with trying to do their work in the public interest are a bit in the dark. Matthew, do you think a Bill of Rights would make any difference if it included things like media freedom along with other human rights for Australia?
I'm not sure about a Bill of Rights, but I do think that some act which actually enshrines freedom of the press, or the media really, more broadly than the press, is needed. We don't actually have that at present at all. We have, through a High Court decision that occurred nearly 30 years ago, what's called an implied right of freedom of political communication. And as you can hear from the language, that's very sort of hedged. So we have a whole lot of acts that have been brought in, as I said, in the last 20 years about national security. National security is clearly an important issue. We are living in a different world now to what we were living in the 1990s or 80s, but we still don't have any kind of legislated freedom of the press and acknowledgement that it's of its role. It's implied, it's in that one High Court case back from about 1992. That's what I think needs, and that was one of the actual legitimate arms or elements of the debate against the report that Ray Finkelstein and I handed down, which was, well, you want to improve the regulation, but don't we also need to improve freedom of the press first? If you beef up regulation, don't you need to beef up freedom of the press as well? Which was a good point, a good debate to have had. We could have had then.
The flip side to this, of course, is whether or not the model of media that served us however reasonably over the last however many hundred years, whether it serves our purposes as a democracy into the future, which raises the incredibly vexed question, and to start for each of you, but to start, Matthew, with you, where does the money come from for investigative journalism when the model, the business model of the, in particular, big empires that we're used to, when that seems to be collapsing in front of our eyes?
Well, that is a real problem, and it's a really urgent issue which I would love for there to be more public discussion and attention paid to it, because, as I said earlier, quoting Emily Bell, Facebook has eaten the world, and financially, Facebook and Google, their market capitalisation absolutely dwarfs even that of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, like 10, 15 times bigger. Okay, they are huge, huge global companies. They employ many, many lobbyists to argue for them in various parliaments around the world. And the dance that is going on about them and regulation that John alluded to earlier is just that at the moment, as far as I can see, a dance. So they do put some money into news and so on, and you know, the views about that are mixed. The Google News initiative and so on, some people think that's great that they're starting to actually take it seriously. Some people think it's kind of like lolly water. They're just sort of trying to placate people in the industry and indeed in academia by getting, you know, people like myself to do, as in academics in journalism, to do research. The other arm of it about which I'm very concerned is the public broadcasters in this country, the ABC and SBS. There's quite a shift going on in not so much in the public debate, but at the political level, the culture wars level. It's not simply a kind of, oh, there goes those lefties at the ABC again sort of debate. It's, we want to stop the ABC, we want to privatise it, or we want to kill it altogether. And as far as I can see, there's never been a greater time for the ABC. I mean, now... In less than an hour, there'll be a Four Corners program on tonight, which you may have heard about in the news today, to do with concerns about St Kevin's in Melbourne, very prestigious Catholic school, covering up and not dealing properly with one of their teachers who was alleged and then convicted of grooming sexual abuse of one of the students there. So those programs take about 6 weeks to pull together. How many other commercial media outlets, particularly in broadcast, have the time or resources to devote to that kind of investigation? And yet that's enormously important work that gets done, and so that's my question there. So,
all right, now very briefly, in maybe 1 minute or so, each of you, starting with you, Matthew, and then working up to Richard, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
You have to stay optimistic. David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, says there is to be despairing about the state of the news media or of politics in his country, indeed in ours, is to be self-indulgent. And so, in my view, you must be optimistic.